The slats performed very well generally, so those sheep throughout that 6 week period generally scored around about 4. So again, 5 being very clean. The sawdust performed really well to begin with, and then by about week 4 it started to decline, and that's probably reached its point of absorbency. I mean, it got filled up, I suppose, in that. So that gives us thoughts in terms of when that has to be fully replenished. And both the straw systems were good in terms of generally scoring between 4s and 3.5 through that 6 week period.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Now, in a year where bedding supplies are limited and indeed quite expensive, many are looking at what are the alternative options to help stretch out supplies this winter and maybe provide an alternative than straw. So to that end, I'm joined in this week's episode by independent sheep and beef consultant Dr. Liz Genever to talk to us about an on-farm project she was involved in examining various bedding options a number of years ago. We discussed the different bedding options they compared, how the project was set up and what they examined. Liz discusses the levels of usage of the various bedding sources, the labour input involved, yoke cleanliness and ultimately the costs. We move on to discuss the suitability of each of the bedding options, a hybrid bedding model incorporating different bedding options, how the farm where the project was conducted and changed practice in the subsequent years. We finish up with Liz highlighting ways to stretch supplies, highlighting key areas to focus on. We start off, however, with Liz giving us some background to the project itself.
Yeah, so I was working on behalf of Farming Connect, and I was working with a farming family down in the South Welsh valleys. They have nearly 1,000 ewes and generally house them for a good chunk of the winter. They're on quite heavy peat type soils. And so they were really, as part of the Monitor Farm programme, they were interested in understanding options around bedding. It was done over the winter of 2021, so it was a year where straw prices were high in the UK. And so they were just also interested in looking at alternatives.
I suppose that's part of the reason I have you on the podcast with me today. We're experiencing something similar here in terms of straw being expensive, but also the availability of it is challenging. So it's maybe no harm to hear what you actually did in that project. So maybe just to give us a little bit of context, what did you look at in terms of the alternative bedding options on that farm?
So we considered wheat straw, barley straw, sawdust. We also looked at EnviroBed, which is a type of paper waste, and they'd just retrofitted a shed with some slats. So I'd put a tank underneath and then bought some second-hand pig slats and had just retrofitted them in. And so we're also evaluating them against those bedding options.
So how did you go about looking at that? Maybe just give me the setup of it on the farm.
So we were fortunate they're really willing to put 20 ewes into different pens. So one pen was with wheat straw, one pen was with barley straw, sawdust, EnviroBed, and then they had a small pen within the slatted sheds that we also monitored the sheep within that. There was slightly more sheep in the slatted pens, but the area was adjusted accordingly.
Okay, so look, a nice enough setup, a reasonable comparison across them. So what were the kind of measures you looked at?
So the real questions, I suppose, was cost. So how much is it costing per ton? But then we needed to look at usage. So how much were we using of those products over? And this was done over a 6 weeks period, sort of post scanning, pre lambing sort of period, and so we were really interested in usage. We were interested in cleanliness. And for that, we use the meat hygiene score, which is based in the UK, which is used within abattoirs to look at animals in the layerage, with 1 being very dirty and 5 being very clean. On the farm, there was also a particular query about lameness. They had a little bit of a lameness problem in house sheep, so we're also monitoring lameness.
So look, you really addressed some of the really practical questions we need to look at. Maybe if we break them down and just go through each of them individually of what you found. I might park the cost one to the very end, and if we maybe look at usage, and I suppose when I'm asking about usage, Liz, and you probably had a measure of this as well, we also have to maybe factor in the labour associated with, particularly like a sawdust, it's going to be slightly different to dispense. How did that stack up with the different products you compared?
So in terms of wheat straw, so again, over this 6 week period, wheat straw, we used just over 350 kilos of wheat straw. Sawdust, about 900 kilos of sawdust was used. Barley straw 300 kilos, and the EnviroBed product just over 800 kilos were used over that 6 week period. Obviously on the slat, 0 bedding was used.
Okay, so them numbers, that's per pen. So that's 20 sheep in a pen. Break that down, it's coming out at what, about barley straw 15 kilos per ewe, wheat 17 and a half, and sawdust 45 kilos. And
Yeah, and
Envirobed 40.
Envirobed would be just under that, 40 odd
Okay.
probably.
So quite a bit of difference in terms of physically how much you have to put into them pens. For a labour point of view, obviously that had an impact as well then.
Yeah, and in terms of as I mentioned, we tracked labour, and the labour we did it or I calculated it as a cost perspective, but you could generally see that the barley, straw, and wheat system had used less labour, and then the sawdust environment was quite similar, and it's partly driven by the absorbency. And the farmers they made the decision about topping up that bedding based on the cleanliness of the pen and the cleanliness of the sheep. So they would bed according to what they felt was right, and then just recorded um, how much was being used and obviously the time spent doing it. And that's what we used to within the analysis.
Yeah, look, obviously they want to keep the pens right, but like at a basic level, if you're putting in 45 kilos per euro of sawdust versus 15 of barley, there's physically going to be a difference there in how much you're putting into it. And then I suppose the practicalities of dispensing that within a pen, possibly a bit more manual.
Yeah, and I think in reality doing this was very much a trial doing on single pens. So yeah, when you start to scale this up, it's quite a lot of product you're moving around, definitely.
Okay. Look, so that's the usage end of it, and I suppose all that's relative to cost. That then we might come back to. In terms of cleanliness, like that's the other important aspect of this. We've used in lamb, particularly as we go closer towards lamb, we want to keep cleanliness right. You did measure that. You mentioned it. You used the meat hygiene score. Maybe just to recap that again for me and what the differences you found were.
So the slats performed very well generally. So those sheep throughout that 6 week period generally scored around about 4. So again, 5 being very clean. Um, the sawdust performed really well to begin with, and then by about week 4, it started to decline, and that's probably reached its point of absorbency. I mean, it got filled up, I suppose, in that. So that gives us thoughts in terms of when that has to be fully replenished. Both the straw systems were good in terms of generally scoring between 4s and like 3.5 through that 6 week period. The EnviroBed started at sort of 3-ish, so they were dirtier on that at the beginning. But again, according to the meat hygiene service, 3 is acceptable in terms of animals moving through lairage. So it wasn't like they were scoring 1s, but that it was noticeably dirtier than the other systems. And then actually the farmer took the decision to end that trial in week 5. They just didn't want to continue with it because of that.
So the environment option like was more or less ruled out at that point just for practical reasons. It wasn't
Yeah.
a runner.
Yeah, and I think and I know we haven't talked about the cost, but yeah, they used more. Its price per ton was equal. So yeah, it didn't feel the right thing to be using, and also those animals, they felt that it wasn't quite right for the animals by week 5.
Yeah, look, practically the availability of that might be probably a lot more limited. Like the sawdust option is interesting there, but I think you touched on it fine. Like at 5 to 6 weeks, it nearly reached maximum soakage or compaction, whichever way you want to look at it. Um, does pose a little practical management issue. You probably have to go back in again, clean out, and start fresh.
Yeah, and I mean that's the possibility. Depends on. It's certainly looking like 5 weeks was when you would need to do a refresh um of that system.
I suppose we put that in context. Like we're talking about Joe's been housed at the moment. That 5 to 6 weeks brings us to mid-February. It's really a point from there on in. We really need to watch hygiene in our pens. So, yeah, it's just one of them practical issues you've seen. I think it's an interesting point on it. Look, the other one we touched on was the cost, and I suppose all this is relative to price of straw in a given year, availability. I'm not going to ask you to speculate, but maybe just if you could tell us what the costs were for that particular trial, and we can work with relative to that.
Yeah, so we were on that year working on £100 a ton for wheat straw, £20 a ton for sawdust, which was a local supply, and that was them picking it up. Barley straw, £100 per ton. That was delivered just as the wheat straw was. And EnviroBed was £186 a ton, and that was also delivered onto farm.
And then when you factor that in, you see, the usage levels on it. How did they compare when you put it all together?
So we were looking at bedding cost across those sort of 4 systems. So total cost again for this 6 week period for wheat straw was around about £40. Bedding cost for sawdust was around £20. Bedding cost for barley straw was just under £40, so say 35. Envirobed bedding cost was £150 for that 6 week or 5 week period. And then labour costs was around 50 for wheat straw, 60 for sawdust, barley straw 50, and Envirobed was around 60. And so what that meant when we broke it down to pence per day for a ewe, so we combined both the bedding costs and the labour cost, it worked in to be about 12 pence per day per ewe for wheat straw, around about 11 pence a day for sawdust, 10 pence a day for barley straw. Envirobed was 31 pence per day. So there was this big jump up for Envirobed. We did, for the slats, we did do a calculation based on depreciation of that slatted system, and that was coming around about 3 pence a day per ewe.
Okay, so a big difference there in cost. I suppose that calculation for the slats does account for depreciation over a long time as well. So look, that will depend on the initial cost. It varies, but it's no harm to have that figure. Liz, you also mentioned, like, in terms of other issues on the farm, you looked at lameness as well. Was there any big differences between them, and maybe was the overall incidence that high?
So, bearing in mind we're talking of like 120 sheep over this 6 week period when you include the 20 in 4 pens, and then there was a few more on the smaller slatted pen. And so we had 8 sheep that were recorded over that period, of which 5 of them were on the wheat straw system. So we can read big things into that, but obviously it's only 5 sheep, so you just have to be careful. But the farmer, there was one then on sawdust and then 2 on the Envirobed system. So there was 0 recorded lame sheep on the slatted system or the barley straw system. So based on that and other factors, what the farmers did after that was they chose not to purchase any wheat straw in, or not to bed on wheat straw, just to see if whether that would help the lameness issues. We couldn't ever get to the bottom of why wheat straw in particular would cause more lameness. It could be that there was just an infected ewe in that, and so it infected more sheep within that trial. But that was the decision they took, was they weren't bringing any more wheat straw into that system.
You could have a bit bias and all, but look, it's an interesting observation. Look, just in terms of practically on that farm, like, what did they do after that trial? So they got the benefit of actually seeing all the different products in use. They did the measurements on it. They did the due diligence. You touched on one aspect of the wheat straw. Like, what have they used since, or have they gone back to the basics of just going with barley straw?
So they are using the sawdust, and they're using that just because they've got a local supply, and that I suppose is key to all of this, isn't it? It's about understanding where your supplies are coming from. So they're using the sawdust, and that's particularly for ewe lambs that are being housed or pre-lambing ewes. When they move into lambing pens, they're on barley straw, so they're still purchasing barley straw in. And then on some of those pens, they're using sawdust as a base and then barley straw over the top. And that's particularly if they're having to keep using lambs in pre-turnout. And in reality, they've got more, or certainly looking to invest in more slatted shed systems. So they're just at the point of lambing. Those sheep are moved into those either sawdust or sawdust plus straw pens for lambing, and then move into individual pens. So there's a limit they obviously need a proportion of their sheds that still have bedding in them for that lambing period.
Like, I take it from that, and it's one bit you didn't get to look at, obviously for practical reasons, but that hybrid option of maybe if you're in a situation where bedding is tight, that hybrid option of maybe trying to extend it by using sawdust in combination with straw is something they've actually incorporated into their own farm. It would seem like a readily available practical measure.
Yeah, and I think some of this is a bit of test and trial, isn't it, on people's farms, knowing what's available and all of that. But I think it's sort of thinking of that sawdust acting as the absorbent beneath, and then the barley straw above sort of just being topped up as and when, just to keep those animals cleaner.
And like from your cleanliness measure in that area, it would nearly seem like a better option than going with just a sole stand of sawdust and then maybe switching over.
Yeah, and I think, and also, as June, back to that point of when will those pens need mucking out? Again, if you're putting some straw on top, it might give you an extra few weeks before those pens need cleaning out. And again, it also depends on, I know in certain where they're housing sheep for long periods, it's partly about a build up of bedding over time, isn't it? And then how it affects like feeding races and all sorts of things.
Okay, at the end of the day, it all depends on what's available locally and what prices going in at.
Yep. There's other things we need to look at. So, June, what can we do to try and reduce the humidity in sheds? So, thinking about water, is there any water leaks? What's happening during roof positions, guttering, all that, trying to reduce that humidity. I know it's easier said than done when you've got a lot of sheep in there breathing, but there's also things we can do about ventilation just to try and reduce that moisture in the air.
And it's in a year where supplies are short, or for bedding supplies are short, we actually start to think and look at these things in a bit more detail.
Yeah, and the challenge we always have is that there's specialist sheep sheds, but they're only generally used for a few months of the year, aren't they? So the investment in some of that kit isn't there, but I think it's sort of looking at a sort of a longer term view.
Liz, appreciate that update. It's an interesting project. It's certainly one that's relevant at the moment. Thanks very much for coming on with us.
No worries.
We'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Liz for coming on with us again and going through the project she was involved in, and we were certainly interesting aspects of, particularly around the usage and the impact that it may have on cleanliness. Hopefully some parts of that may be useful to some of our listeners and what they can incorporate into their own farming systems. That's it for me for this episode. For updates on our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us for more episodes.